10 years ago, when the movie An Inconvenient Truth came out, the single most criticized scene in that movie was an animated scene showing that the combination of sea level rise and storm surge would put the ocean water into the 9/11 memorial site, which was then under construction. And people said, that's ridiculous. What a terrible exaggeration.
There is a wake-up call here, and that is climate change and our vulnerability to it. It was true 10 years ago, it was true 5 years ago, it is undeniable today.
That was a clip from An Inconvenient Sequel, Truth to Power, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Mr. Vice President Al Gore. How are you, sir?
I'm fine.
I had the pleasure of chatting to you about the first film, and you reprise this role in this film, and I kind of wanted to ask you what you see your role being in these two films, because you're not the director.
Right.
You're kind of the star, but what do you see? How would you describe your role in these two films? Very important films.
Well, the directors, Bonnie Cohen and John Schenck, are responsible for selecting the content, which is a good thing that I didn't have that right, because in my mind I'm much younger and thinner and have darker hair. But, they just followed me around for 2 years, and I was very surprised when I saw the first rough cut of the film, because for one thing, I realized that I actually had forgotten that the cameras were there
Wow.
for many of those scenes. And I guess it's just human nature that you lose your awareness of something that's always there, especially if you're going through experiences that are very emotional and you're focused on in the moment. And anyway, my role is the same now as it's been for some time, to try to take the findings of the climate scientists, who are kind and patient enough to explain things to me over and over and over again until I can get it into simple language that I can understand, at which point I feel confident that I can communicate it to others.
Well, that's the thing that you do so brilliantly. You talk to people. You're never talking at people, you're talking with people. It's a conversation, and it's an open conversation that you've had, and you're still having. It's 10 years since we had An Inconvenient Truth, 11 years. How do you see the changes? What are the changes in that time frame?
Well, there have been two enormous changes, and then a third that occurred during the filming. The two big changes over the previous decade have been, number one, that the climate-related extreme weather events have become, unfortunately, far more common and more destructive. The UK has had its share of these record-breaking, historic downpours that flood entire regions of the country for extended periods of time. Just last week in southern Europe, there were fires across southern Europe in the heat wave they named Lucifer. And in my country last week, two cities, Miami and New Orleans, were paralyzed by these record downpours they're calling rain bombs. You get 7 inches of rain in 2 hours. It just stops everything. So that's a big change, and I won't go through the full list of all the different events that have really been waking people up more and more. But the second big change is a positive one. We have the solutions now, and it's been astonishing to see how the cost of electricity from solar energy and wind energy has come down so rapidly and continues to come down. Last year, 75% of all the new electricity generation in the U.S. was from solar and wind. And many countries are now just switching over rapidly. Many cities are going to 100% renewable energy. So now the third change that occurred during the filming was that for the first time after 20 years of work, the entire world, save a couple of exceptions, agreed in this historic Paris agreement to go to net zero global warming pollution by mid-century. And that is really a great achievement. And we now can look forward to solving this. But we do need to build the political will. But political will is itself a renewable resource.
All these things that you say, and it's there. You just watch the news reports and you see this is happening.
Every night it's like a nature hike through the book of Revelation.
This is not a film, This
Right.
this is not a piece of fiction. This is happening, which baffles me when you still have these people who will not. They don't get it. It's like they're questioning it.
Well, we have a saying in my home state of Tennessee in the American South that when you see a turtle on top of a fence post, you can be pretty sure it didn't get there by itself. And when you see this persistent climate denial with you can be sure that didn't occur spontaneously. And in fact, some of the largest carbon polluters are determined to really fight hard to keep what they view as their right to use the sky as an open sewer free of charge. And destroy the future if that happens. Well, they don't seem to care. 100 years ago, a famous journalist in the U.S., Upton Sinclair, said it's difficult to get a man to understand something if his salary depends upon him not understanding it. And these carbon polluters have used enormous sums, over $1 billion, to do exactly what the tobacco companies did years ago when the doctors connected up the dots between cigarette smoking and lung cancer and other diseases. They hired actors and dressed them up as doctors and put them in front of cameras to falsely reassure people that there were no such health consequences. And 100 million people died because they were able to delay the changes in public policy necessary to stop young people from beginning to smoke and to convince others to stop killing themselves. And the carbon polluters are doing exactly the same thing. And they've taken the same playbook, hired many of the same PR agents. If you believe in karma, you have to wonder what's in store for them.
Well, that's it. How do you convince them? What do you have to do to convince them? And to, the skeptics, what do you have to say or do? Or what do they have to see or experience for them to realise that this is real and it's happening?
Well, I've come to believe that Mother Nature is a far more persuasive advocate than I am, but I chip away at it, as do millions of grassroots activists around the world. And in, the United States and to some degree the United Kingdom are really the only places where you have this persistent denial. And the carbon polluters hire their lobbyists and spokespeople who use the political and economic power they have, and they persuade some commentators on the radio to spout this denial constantly. And some people are fooled by it. But increasingly people are seeing through it, and they're recognizing that this climate movement is actually in the tradition of other great movements for civil rights and anti-apartheid and women's rights, gay rights more recently. And over time, these great movements do win out as people push the straw men aside and focus on the central question, which is a choice between what's right and what's wrong. And when the future of human civilization is in the balance, then it's pretty important to get that right.
It's a really poignant film that's really raw, and it's emotional as well. And we, as well as kind of following you in your role, in this incredible role which you describe in the film as your mission as well, we see you in really poignant moments as well at home on your ranch, and that lovely letter from your daughter as well. It's, for you, what was the most poignant experience of making this second film?
Well, there were many, but I would single out the encounters I had with survivors in the Philippines of the most powerful typhoon ever to make landfall. It caused over 4 million homeless climate refugees. It killed thousands. And those who lost family members and went through the harrowing experience of that disaster, which of course occurred because the storm crossed over ocean waters many degrees warmer, because the global warming pollution traps all this heat energy, mainly in the oceans. But hearing them recount their experiences and feeling the raw emotions they went through was quite touching to me.
There's one scene as well that I really want to know what happened after that. I'm hoping it might be on the DVD extras. When you go in the gold lift on Trump Tower to go up,
yeah.
and I'm like, I want to know what those conversations were. It's like, what were the conversations that you had with him? Because, he surprised us all, unfortunately, with his decision with Paris, which I know doesn't come into effect till 2020, potentially.
Yeah, it can't legally take effect until the day after the next presidential election, at
Fingers
which point,
crossed.
at which point, if there is a new president, by then or before, a new president could simply give 30 days notice and get back in the agreement. And more importantly, in the interim, the governors of our largest states and mayors of cities across America and business leaders have said, look, we don't care what he's said. This is silly. We're going to meet the terms of this agreement. Anyway, the whole world has decided to move. Now, as for the conversations, I have respected the privacy of those conversations. I think any president is entitled to that respect, even one I disagree with strongly. But I will tell you this much. He gave me reason to believe that he would stay in the Paris Agreement, and I thought that he would come to his senses, but I was wrong. And I think it's because he has surrounded himself with a rogues gallery of climate deniers, spokespeople for the carbon polluters, who again have an enormous amount of money at stake, and they found ways to bend some politicians to their will.
I have some listener questions, if you wouldn't mind asking.
Sure.
The first one's from Ntombi, who says, do you think, kind of following on what you were saying there, do you think the high-ranking politicians who express doubt or outright disbelief about climate change are sincere? Or are they saying those things so that they can roll back regulations and benefit certain industries without seeming incredibly destructive?
Well, I think that it's the latter, but if we were able to look into people's hearts and find their true motivations, I suspect that we would find some of them who actually have come to believe the nonsense they repeat. But I know for a fact, that an absolute fact, that there are many of them who do know that what they're saying is wrong. I had an experience recently, last year, when one of these climate deniers in a right-wing think tank who had worked for 20 years spreading this denial, he came up to me in a public place and said, do you have a moment? And I talked with him. His name is Jerry Taylor. And he said, you've convinced me. I have changed, and I quit this job. And he went to another institution. And we talked for a long time, and he told me that he personally knows 10 Republican members of the U.S. Senate who know full well that the positions they take are wrong, and they're trying to find their way back from the end of the long limb they've crawled out on. Some of them are worried that if they do change, the carbon polluters will finance a right-wing opponent for them in their primary elections. We have primaries and then the general election. And some of them, thankfully, are now publicly changing. Too few, but some of them are. There's a new caucus in the Congress. I'm sorry to dwell on this, but it's called the Noah's Ark Caucus. And it's a reference to the biblical deluge, but it's also a reference to the fact that people can only join in pairs by twos. And specifically, they have to have one Democrat and one Republican joined together. And so it's inspired a lot of conversations among friends, and there are still friendships across these partisan lines. And they're joining up, and several Republican members of Congress have decided to join this Noah's Ark caucus. And we're not far from a working majority on this issue in the U.S. Congress.
Every step helps. Tim says the first film was very optimistic about being able to solve global problems through collaboration. Mr. Gore, is there still hope? And is the private sector more likely than government to be more helpful?
Well, we need both, and the answer to the question is yes, there is a hope, absolutely. To be searingly honest about this, we have to acknowledge that some of the damage that has already been done may not be recoverable. Some large sections of Antarctica, for example, have now crossed a tipping point beyond which the ice will melt and raise sea levels considerably, no matter what we do. However, accepting that, and temperatures will continue to increase, but accepting that, the scientists do assure us that there is still time to avoid the most catastrophic harm that would threaten the future of civilization. We have the means to do it. It's a little bit like, to go back to the smoking cigarettes analogy, sometimes a person who smoked cigarettes for 40 years, several packs a day, will say to the doctor, well, I'm done for. There's no point in quitting now. And the doctor said, well, wait a minute. Here's what the science shows. If you stop, then your lungs will begin to heal and you'll have an elevated risk, but it will diminish year by year as soon as you stop this deadly habit. And the same thing is true here. If we could somehow magically go to zero man-made global warming pollution tomorrow, it would take only 20 years for half of the pollution to fall back out of the sky. Now, some of it would remain there for thousands of years, and there will be further harm. But we can pull back from this precipice and say to the next generations, okay, it's going to be fine. We're not going to have these catastrophic consequences.
Last question, I'm afraid. I could chat to you for hours. I want to know if you are a fan of any fictional films that you think touch on the global warming or climate change issues that have done a really good job with that. Is there anything that springs to mind for you?
Well, some of them are a little bleak, like Cormac McCarthy's The Road.
Yeah, great film.
And some of them get the science wrong, but still... there was a film, actually it played a small role in leading to my first movie. It was a fictional film called The Day After, and it concentrated on something the scientists were worried about a great deal at the time, that the Gulf Stream would shut down and the warming effect that it brings to England and Northeast America would stop, and then it would get very, very cold. And that actually did happen 10,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age, and it's complicated to go through why it did. But anyway, I was asked at the time, is this a fiction? Is this fiction? And I said, well, yes, but it's not as fictional as the Bush Cheney's administration's view. But anyway, it was at an event following that movie's release, where some of us in the environmental movement were saying, look, this is not quite right, but go see this film because it does actually raise awareness. And it was there when I was giving my slideshow that a figure in Hollywood, Laurie David, used to be married to Larry David, said, oh, you've got to make that slideshow into a movie. And I said, well, that's silly. You can't make a slideshow into a movie. But one thing led to another, and they're so talented in Hollywood, they actually were able to make a slideshow into a movie.
And here we are talking about the second one. Absolute pleasure chatting to you. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.